Every day, drivers crossing into Illinois at its southernmost tip pass beneath something extraordinary. An iron gate the size of a building. This is the relic of one of the most dramatic engineering gambles in American history. A structure built to seal off an entire city from the outside world as a last line of defense against two of the most powerful rivers on Earth. And the gate has a name, the Big Subway Gate. To understand why it exists, you first need to understand the city it was built to protect. So stay tuned as we uncover the story of Cairo and its forgotten subway gate. I'm your host Ryan Sokash, and you're watching Its History. Sitting at the absolute southern tip of Illinois, Cairo occupies a narrow peninsula of land wedged between two of the country's mightiest rivers, the Mississippi to the west and the Ohio to the east. At that junction, they together drain close to 1 million square miles of North America interior. The name itself tells you something about the ambition that the place once inspired. Early settlers at the junction saw it as their version of the Nile Delta, and so they called it Cairo, which I've been told locals pronounce as Cairo. Anyhow, the first municipal charter was issued in 1818, but no one came to the town. So a second attempt was made in 1836 when the Cairo City and Canal Company built a large encircling dike and tried to bring the town into existence. Though that effort also collapsed within just a few years. By 1840, the place was still nearly empty. But then came Charles Dickens. In 1842, the most celebrated novelist in the English-speaking world had arrived by steamboat. Apparently, what he found at the junction of the two rivers disgusted him. He described the place as detestable and a place of death. He was apparently so repulsed by what he saw that he used it as a model for one of his fictional locations, a town called Eden, where gullible immigrants arrived full of hope and left broken-hearted and diseased. So, as you might imagine, something like that coming from one of the most famous writers on Earth was some seriously bad PR. Yet, Cairo survived the insult, and eventually, it thrived. The turnaround came in the 1850s, when investors secured Cairo as the southern terminus of the Illinois Central Railroad. The railroad arrived in 1855, and almost immediately, the town transformed. By 1859, cotton, wool, molasses, and sugar were moving through the port. With that, Cairo became the county seat of Alexander County in 1860. Then the Civil War arrived, and with it, the town's finest hour. Notably, General Grant made Cairo his military headquarters in 1861 and 1862. You see, the city's position, controlling access to both rivers, made it the strategic hinge of the entire Western theater of war. Union forces used it as a naval base for the Mississippi River Squadron, from which they launched campaigns that would eventually sever the Confederacy. And with that, the very geography that Dickens found miserable turned out to be a military asset of the first order. After the war, the boom continued. Cairo's population nearly tripled in the decades following the conflict, with factories, a brass foundry, a steam engine plant, and boiler works all opening in the process. The town had 5 newspapers to keep the residents informed, and the waterfront was filled with mansions for wealthy merchants. By the turn of the century, Cairo had a population of around 13,000 people, so it was an optimistic, proper river city, though the residents would soon learn the downside of that situation. Remember, the city sat on low, flat land between two of the most flood-prone rivers in North America. At certain times of the year, the water didn't just rise at the banks. Rather, it would engulf the entire region, which is why the first levees went up during the Civil War, and they did hold most of the time. But the floods kept coming. Especially high waters swamped the city in 1883, 1897, 1903, and then again in 1913. Each time, the engineers reinforced and tried to stay one step ahead of the river, but most of the time it was done in vain. The bigger problem they faced was the shape of Cairo itself. It was basically a peninsula, barely above sea level, jutting into the space between the two rivers, both of which could flood independently or simultaneously. So by the early 1900s, city leaders and engineers were asking a different question entirely. They asked, could you seal the city tightly enough for survival and relieve pressure on the entire system by deliberately breaching levees? The answer they decided was yes, but this essentially required fortifying the town, closing every possible point of entry from rising water, including the new highway that ran straight through the northern levee. The highway tunnel through the northern point was built in 1903. It was a concrete arch bridge, 94 feet wide, which was wide enough that locals called it the tunnel, even though technically it was open to the sky. US Highway 51 ran right through it, carrying traffic into Cairo from the north. Now, that roadway in particular presented a problem, as without it, the levee would be intact. With it, there was a gap. So, for the planners to make Cairo a true island in the case of a flood, that gap had to be closable. The solution was audacious. In 1914, the city contracted the Stupp Brothers Bridge and Iron Company of St. Louis to build a floodgate at the northern point. Generally, the gate would hang above the highway like a curtain, though in an emergency, it could be lowered to seal the opening completely. Work began on April the 29th, 1914, and was completed by August the 23rd, 10 days ahead of schedule. What they built was remarkable. The project was modeled on the gates of the Panama Canal, which had just been completed a year prior. The final result weighed 80 tons, was 60 feet wide, 20 feet high, with walls 5 feet thick. The counterweights used to raise and lower it weighed nearly as much as the gate itself, and engineers calculated that weight so precisely that 2 men, one on each side, could raise and lower the structure. So with that, on August the 28th, 1914, the big subway gate was given its first formal test, and it worked. Cairo reached its peak population of nearly 15,000 in 1920, and by that time, the gate had become a local landmark. Oddly though, it was already seen as more of a curiosity than a necessity. But then came January of '37. That winter, the Ohio River Valley received something close to a month of relentless rain. We're talking nearly 13 inches of precipitation over a few weeks, falling on ground that was already saturated by prior storms. So from Pittsburgh to Cairo, the Ohio River began to rise with a speed and ferocity that overwhelmed every measurement on record. Generally speaking, Midwestern cities drowned one by one as the crest moved downstream. In Cincinnati, the river reached nearly 8 feet, 9 feet above the previous record. In Louisville, Kentucky, 67% of the city went underwater. By the time the crest reached Cairo, 1 million people across the valley had been made homeless, and nearly 400 were dead. At Cairo, the crest was so high that the margin was 4 inches above normal flood stage. Just 4 inches. So the Army Corps of Engineers made 2 decisions simultaneously. They closed the big subway gate, lowering 80 tons of iron down over the highway, sealing the tunnel, and made Cairo into an island. From there, they blew a breach in the Birds Point levee across the river in Missouri, flooding 130,000 acres of farmland to relieve the pressure bearing down on the city's walls. This was the first time that either measure had ever been deployed. Inside the sealed city, women and children had already been evacuated, but able-bodied men remained, reinforcing the levee with sandbags as the water climbed towards the lip of the wall. Miraculously, the city held. However, this might have been salvation in vain, as in the years to come, Cairo would face a different type of dramatic downfall. The decline came from multiple directions, and none of them had anything to do with water. First, the railroad bridges completed in 1929 and '37 were supposed to be progress, and for the rest of America they were. But the bridges connecting Missouri and Kentucky at Cairo's southern tip bypassed the city entirely. Furthermore, interstate highways meant that motorists no longer needed to stop there, and so the economy just started to downward spiral. By the 1950s, those railroad car ferries were nothing but a memory. The hospital closed in '86, and the last grocery store left town in 2015, wouldn't be replaced until 2023. So, in that downfall, the city's social tensions boiled over, destabilizing the economy completely. For reference, sources present Cairo as having had a difficult history of racial tension, starting with the 1909 lynching of William James. For decades on from that point, local African American residents reported living under the explicit threat of their neighbors. By the late 1960s, that tension reached its breaking point, as in July of that year, a 19-year-old soldier named Robert Hunt was arrested on questionable charges and found deceased in his cell. So, in the historic context of the lynching, the community there was suspicious of the circumstances, to say the least, and so they took to the streets. What followed was 3 days of riots, and for years after, the city was essentially divided. There were race-based economic boycotts, sporadic violence, and a lost unity. Understandably, that tension drove thousands of residents away, forcing the city into an even worse state of affairs. By 1980, the population had fallen by more than half from its peak, and the community fell apart. Think about it. The city had been Grant's headquarters, survived great floods, and was becoming something else, a case study in American abandonment. In 2011, the rivers made one more attempt on the town. That spring, a combination of snowmelt and heavy rainfall pushed the Ohio towards record levels once again. Though the entire city by that point had fewer than 3,000 people, and so everyone was ordered to evacuate. And once again, the water poured from the sky and consumed entire streets. So the Army Corps of Engineers faced that same calculation once again. Should they detonate the levee to save the town? This time, however, they hesitated. The decision was delayed for days as the river climbed and the surrounding communities flooded. Then, when they finally did detonate the levee, a subsequent report concluded that the delay had cost millions of dollars in avoidable damage. As for the big subway gate, it didn't move this time. By 2011, that system was no longer considered operational for its original purpose. Modular flood control panels stored off-site had replaced it as a more practical solution for sealing the northern point. And so the old gate, with its iron counterweights still in place, hung above the highway as nothing more than a monument to a bygone time. Today, Cairo is a shell of its former sense. As of 2024, the city had around 1,500 residents, a tenth of its peak. Commercial Street, once lined with the businesses of a boomtown, is now a corridor of collapsing facades and rotting timber. Buildings designed in the 1870s and 80s, when Cairo was flush with Civil War profits and railroad money, have been standing empty for decades. As for the big subway gate, well, it still hangs above US Highway 51 at the Northern Levee, exactly where the Stupp brothers installed it in 1914. We'll leave it there for today, but I thank you all for watching, and as always, this is Ryan Socash, signing off.